we're almost done. One last video describing the movement of molecules across the membrane. So up until this point, we've seen videos that summarize the process of diffusion, where the movement of particles occurs from a high concentration to a low concentration. And you can see that up here in this diagram. And diffusion also works for water, so these purple particles could be water just as easily as they could be any solute particle. But what we assumed in the case of diffusion is that those particles could cross the membrane. And we know not all particles can cross the membrane. Remember, only nonpolar particles can cross the membrane freely, and really only small polar molecules like water can cross the membrane. Large polar molecules are not going to be able to get across. So how do they get across? Well, you've also seen a video that described the use of a transport protein to facilitate the movement of that protein across the membrane, or any molecule for that matter. That's what this second picture describes, the process of facilitated diffusion, where particles are still moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, but in this case the particle can't cross the membrane on its own, and it needs to get some help in the form of a transport protein. The only form of transport that we haven't seen is active transport. In an active transport, we're not actually going to move particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. We're going to move particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. And because now we're not going to be able to use molecular collisions to, if you will, power the movement of those particles from one location to the next, we're going to have to invest some amount of energy. And that energy is going to come in the form of ATP, so that those particles end up being pumped across the membrane rather than just move as a result of intermolecular collisions. So in simple diffusion, again, no energy is required because those particles are simply going to bounce off one another and spread out into empty space. And molecules like water and carbon dioxide and oxygen can all move across the membrane by simple diffusion. But again, most particles, especially those large polar ones, can't cross the membrane by themselves. They have to get help, and that help comes in the form of a transport protein. So transport proteins are involved in facilitated diffusion, where facilitate means to help or to assist, and it's going to be those small polar molecules, those large polar molecules, and ions that use facilitated diffusion, that use transport proteins to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Well, that explains the forms of passive transport, both diffusion and facilitated diffusion, but we need to talk a little bit more about active transport. So in active transport, as we saw on the previous slide, particles are going to move from a low concentration to a high concentration, and that's going to require energy. Luckily, we're still going to need a transport protein. So facilitated diffusion and active transport are going to be similar in that they both require a transport protein. What's different is that active transport requires energy, and particles are going to move from a low concentration to a high concentration. So what does active transport look like? Well, we're going to use energy to move particles, and we're going to move those particles via a transport protein that will help those particles that normally cannot get across the membrane move across the membrane. And we're going to move particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. So it looks a little bit like this. Here's your transport protein. Here's your solute particle. Remember, this can be any large polar molecule, and that particle is going to move across the membrane from a low concentration to a high concentration using energy in the form of ATP to pump that particle across the membrane. So I've mentioned ATP a couple of times, but we really haven't had a chance to talk a lot about what ATP does within the cell. If you were to look at the structure of ATP, you'd see that it looks an awful lot like a nucleotide. Remember, nucleotides have three parts. They have a nitrogenous base. In this case, ATP has adenine. There's a sugar. In this case, ATP has the sugar ribose. And there's at least one phosphate group. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has three phosphate groups all bound to each other. ATP is a remarkable molecule because it's these phosphate groups that actually allow ATP to store chemical potential energy. And upon removing a phosphate group through hydrolysis, some of the energy can be released and used by the cell to do work. So again, here's ATP, here's water coming in, so you know that you're dealing with a hydrolysis reaction. Water actually will break the bond between the second and third phosphate groups in ATP and upon breaking that bond, energy will be released, and then energy will be available to do work within the cell. So that's how ATP was going to be used in active transport to move particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. Well, what's an example of active transport in action within a cell? One of the most common examples of active transport is that of the sodium-potassium pump, or the sodium-potassium ATPase. And this pump works by moving sodium ions from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, and potassium ions from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So because we're dealing with active transport, there must be more sodium ions on the outside of the cell than there are on the inside of the cell. Thus, we're moving sodium from the inside to the outside, from where it's less concentrated to where it's more concentrated. And in the case of potassium, there must be more potassium on the inside of the cell compared to the outside of the cell. So we're moving potassium from where it's less concentrated to where it's more concentrated. But that process requires energy. So, in the case of active transport, in the case of the active transport of sodium and potassium via the sodium-potassium pump, we can see that sodium ions bind to the transport protein. ATP is hydrolyzed. In this case, when ATP is hydrolyzed, a phosphate group is added to that transport protein. That causes the shape of the protein to change. Hopefully you could see that here. And the release of sodium ions will occur. As soon as sodium ions are released, potassium ions can bind to that protein. The phosphate group is removed. The shape of the protein returns to its original conformation. Compare this shape to this shape. The potassium ions leave the protein, then they enter the cytosol. And then at that point, that process can repeat. And that's how the active transport of sodium and potassium ions occur by the activity of the sodium-potassium pump.